Well, Rome wasn't built in a day, as the old saying goes, but the author of a new book argues modern Canada was built in about 10. From Just Watch Me to our most recent $10 bill, Paul Henderson's game winning goal in the Summit Series to the Tragically Hip's final concert, just to name a few, these are the days that have helped define the country as we know it today. Here to talk about 10 days that shaped modern Canada is author Aaron Hughes. Welcome, Aaron.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Boiling down about 50 years of history to a mere 10 days is an interesting thought exercise, to be sure. How did you come up with these 10?
Well, that's a good question. So, I came up with the idea and started to write and wrote the book during COVID. I was a visiting professor in Oxford, and I was stuck. All the libraries were closed. So I thought to myself, my wife is Italian, and she doesn't know a lot about Canada. She somehow thinks that Canada is almost an extension of the United States. So I wanted to prove her wrong. So I thought to myself, what are 10 days that are formative for us, for me? And I realize that probably most people who read the book or are listening to this would say, oh, it's ridiculous. How would you choose the 10 days? How would you choose the Tragically Hip's final concert? What's important about that? And my goal for the book is that people, as soon as people would say, I wouldn't have chosen that date. I would have chosen this date. The minute they do that, they're doing what I want them to do. The book does what that is, to get people to think about our rich history, because I don't think we think about Canada's history all that much, because we think of it as such a modern country and we're always looking to other places. And I wanted to show how Canada is this really lovely tapestry of all sorts of things.
Now, the first one, Just Watch Me, based on what is probably the most famous soundbite in Canadian history. What made you include it here?
Well, I really thought that was important because maybe I should just back up one second. The goal of each chapter is not only to explain what happened on a particular day, but what happened because of it. So it focuses, maybe only a part of the chapter focuses on that. And then, this was a way to think about, sort of government oversight. What does it mean to curtail people's rights and freedoms? Because even though Trudeau said it, Pierre Trudeau said it in 1972. Even under the Harper government after 9/11, there were all kinds of conversations about, Muslims, about trading information between CSIS and various organizations. So the goal then is to get Canadians to think about what does it mean for us to be citizens, and what does it mean for the government? How can the government curtail rights at its whim?
I can't help but notice you draw something of a through line from the War Measures Act to the Emergencies Act. It seems both were invoked to meet the challenge of a parallel power, as Pierre Trudeau put it, and both not without their controversies.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's a good point. Is that the chapter ends with Justin Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act to end the convoy in Ottawa and the various border crossings in Alberta and other places. So again, the idea is that even though this happened in 1972, the original issue, we see it move through the generations, and something that's still very much with us today.
Next up, the Summit Series, Paul Henderson's game-winning goal that got Team Canada past the Russians. Definitely one of those you remember where you were type moments to anyone who was upright and breathing in those days. Interesting that you mentioned the Blue Jays and the Raptors championships, but Sidney Crosby's golden goal in Vancouver, February 28, 2010,
exactly.
Notable omission.
Exactly. There you go. That's the book has achieved its purpose with you, John, and that is certainly. One could choose any sort of a goal, but the reason I chose that one is I'm more of a soccer/football fan. I'm not a huge I'm from Edmonton and the Oilers and everything. But I chose the game because of it shows the tensions between the former Soviet Union and the West, and how there were two different styles of hockey, the sort of aggressive Canadian style versus the more skillful Russian style. And then how today, in many ways, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, we now have so many people from the former Eastern Bloc in the NHL, and the style of hockey has changed so much. And the reason I also mentioned the Blue Jays and the Raptors is because I sort of asked myself, would the hockey game bring Canadians together today in the same way that it did in the past? And there I sort of looked a little bit at some of Don Cherry's comments, and And then to follow that forward, I really think that the Tragically Hip's final concert, which is the second last chapter of the book, maybe does something like that today that a hockey game perhaps couldn't.
I wanted to ask about that a little later on, but I'll do so here. I was very heartened to see the Hips final concert included here, but I remember at the time that a lot of people were saying, well, I don't know if they have the same cultural impact that we in the media like to give them. There's a large segment of
Yeah.
the population that has probably had it with the hip worship, and I'm not one of them, obviously, and you're not either. But what do you say to the
No.
folks who are, okay, that's not my experience listening to the hip?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the one hand, I would agree. I mean, and also we could say they're an Anglophone band. I don't think they had nearly the same popularity in Quebec as they have in Anglophone Canada. But at the same time, I know of no other band that well, a band with a significant stature that is so in tune with Canada. So many of its songs are full of Canadian references, but not jingoistic in the way that say someone like Stompin' Tom is. And even you look at another great Canadian band like Rush. You think of what you think of. We know they're from Toronto. They have a song about Canada called YYZ, but of course it's instrumental. There's no lyrics in it. So I really think that the Tragically Hip is deeply woven with the fabric of a certain demographic in Canada. And I also use that chapter though as a way to think about our relationship to the United States. I think sometimes one of the things that we loved about the Hip is that they would go and play concerts up in in high school gymnasia with Indigenous communities. They never quite had the same success in America. Although when I was writing the book, I ended up talking to their manager, who tried to convince me that they did have a modicum of success, and they certainly did. But I think that we really saw them as our band, and especially living next to the United States, which I think David Rakoff once called this culturally destroying behemoth. I mean, it's very hard to maintain a sense of Canadian culture, and I think the Hip really did that for so many of us, and it's a really, really great band.
I think the fact that they weren't as successful in the States probably endeared them to Canadians that much
So
more. Uh,
certainly,
and also the song Fireworks, which references Paul Henderson's goal, of course.
exactly,
A nice self
exactly.
moment for the book. Um,
Can I
now,
just add one thing there? It's funny because it's just how these things go. Is I wanted to start the Hip, the Henderson the Summit series with that lyric, but it's not easy to include it costs a lot of money to for copyright to put a lyric in a book. So I had a lot of Hip lyrics throughout, especially the chapter on the Hip. But I ultimately had to take it off when I saw what they were going to charge for copyright.
uh, maybe for a reprint, you can include a playlist in the back.
That's what I do. Yeah.
I really like that when authors do that. So we went over some of the obvious ones. Were there any that missed the cut? Perhaps you have enough for 10 more days that shape modern Canada.
Yeah, that's funny. I think it definitely the one I really miss not putting in, and I would have if it was 12 days or 11 days, was Terry Fox's Marathon of Hope. I really think that, I mean, really a true Canadian hero. Just so I would have, and another one. I sometimes thought it would have been good to put when Elijah Harper stood up in the Manitoba legislature with his eagle feather and said no, which essentially killed the Meech Lake Accords. Yeah, I think there's all kinds of dates that I didn't include. But again, I think the goal of the book was to jumpstart a conversation. So hopefully readers would say, yeah, I would have chosen this date as well. And the minute they say that, they would have to justify to themselves why they would choose that. And if they do that, the book for me is a success.
Well, that brings me to the final question. What do you hope people get out of the book? Conversation, thinking about what it means to be a Canadian, what it means to be Canada,
Yeah.
those sorts of themes.
Yeah, I mean, the goal for me would be for people to realize that when we pick up a newspaper today, when we read about a Supreme Court case decision, when we read about the expansion of rights under the Charter, or hopefully the expansion of Indigenous rights under the Charter, people will be able to see that these things, they don't come out of thin air, that there's a history to it. And I know sometimes when you say history, People eyes glaze over. So I tried to make it a book that would be exciting and interesting. But the basic goal behind the book was to show Canadians and also others that Canada has this really rich history. And I think this goes back to the HIP chapter, is sometimes we forget that history and we all we hear about is American history. I remember as a kid growing up in Edmonton, we would have these commercials on the cartoons on Saturday mornings talking about the American Constitution. And we have nothing like that now. So in fact, I've just finished a book on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I've called it a biography of the Charters of Rights and Freedoms, which is an attempt to introduce Canadians a little bit more to what the Charter is, because going back to the Emergencies Act, we see a lot of people talk about the Charter, but I'm not always sure that we know what the Charter is. So again, my goal is to show Canadians and non-Canadians that Canada is this really, really rich and lovely country. And I think there's also a chapter there in the Multiculturalism Act. There's a chapter there on the Truth and the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so the goal is not to be jingoistic and say Canada is the best country in the world. It's to show that Canada is a work in progress. But having said that, I think the Canadian experiment is unprecedented. I know of no other country that has really tried to do what we're trying to do. I don't think we always are able to do it, but I want people to have a certain pride in Canada and to believe in it.
The name of the book is 10 Days That Shaped Modern Canada. It's available from the University of Alberta Press. My thanks to author Aaron Hughes.
Thank you, John.